Picture this, a freezing cabin in the deadliest winter of World War II. A mother and her 12-year-old son, alone in enemy territory. 3 wounded American soldiers knock on the door, seeking shelter. She lets them in, knowing it could mean execution. Then comes a second knock. 4 German soldiers, armed and dangerous. In that moment, an ordinary woman makes an impossible choice that transforms sworn enemies into human beings sharing bread at a Christmas table. This is not fiction. This happened on December 24, 1944, in the snow-covered Ardennes forest. One mother's courage stopped a war, if only for one night. The men who sat at that table never forgot what it meant to be human again. And 50 years later, they would reunite to honor the woman who saved their lives. We are dedicated to keeping these stories alive. To support our research and never miss a deep dive, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here. Let's continue. December 24, 1944, 8:47 in the evening. The Hertgen Forest, somewhere in the Ardennes, where the snow fell so thick it muffled even the distant artillery. Inside a hunting cabin no bigger than a modest kitchen, Elisabeth Vincken knelt before a small cast-iron stove, feeding it the last 3 pieces of split oak. Her hands trembled, not from cold, though the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, but from the arithmetic of survival. The wood would last perhaps 90 minutes. The rooster she had killed that morning hung from a rafter, its neck still bent at the unnatural angle of slaughter. She had named him Hermann, after Hermann Göring, the pompous Reichsmarshal, a small act of defiance that made her son Fritz smile. Fritz sat at the rough-hewn table, his breath visible in the amber lamplight, pretending to read a book whose pages he had memorized weeks ago. He was 12 years old and had already learned that survival meant staying quiet, staying small, staying invisible. Elisabeth was not prepared for heroism. She was a baker's wife from Aachen, a woman who measured her life in kilograms of flour and pfennigs counted at day's end. Her husband, Hubert, worked in civil defense in Monschau, trying to hold together what remained of their world. Their bakery, 3 generations of Vinckens had run it, was gone, bombed flat in an Allied raid. She had fled here with Fritz to wait out the war in whatever passed for safety when your country had become a battlefield. But there was another reason she trembled. Another son. Hermann, her eldest, named long before that name became bitter in her mouth, had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. 20 years old. Frozen in the Russian winter, though the official letter said only killed in action. She knew what that meant. She had read between the lines of military euphemisms. Her boy had died slowly, far from home, in a war that made less sense with each passing month. The first knock came at 9:13, 3 sharp raps, then silence. Then 3 more, urgent, insistent. Elisabeth's heart seemed to both stop and accelerate simultaneously. Fritz looked up, his face gone white in the lamplight. Through the single window, darkness pressed against the glass like something alive. She moved to the door, her hand on the latch. The wood grain rough under her palm. "Qui est là?" she called out in French, neutral ground between German and English. "Americans," the word heavily accented. Then, haltingly in French, "Please, we need help. One is wounded." Every propaganda poster she had ever seen flashed through her mind. The enemy, the destroyers. But the voice carried something the posters never showed. Exhaustion, pain, desperation that transcends borders. She opened the door. 3 men stood in knee-deep snow. Boys, really. None looked older than 22. Their olive-drab uniforms were caked with frozen mud. The man in the middle sagged between his companions, his left trouser leg dark with blood, his face gray with shock. They carried no weapons in their hands. Behind them, the forest stretched into darkness. She stepped back, opened the door wider, made a choice. "Entrez," she said. "Come in." They stumbled inside. The wounded man, she would learn his name was Harry Hindenlang, collapsed into the only chair. His companions helped him with practiced gentleness. One wore glasses repaired with wire. The other was shorter, stockier, with kind eyes that reminded her painfully of Hermann. "Merci, madame," the one with glasses said. His name was Jim Rassi, and his French, though imperfect, was understandable. "My friend, he is shot 2 days ago." The third American, Robin Steckel, was already examining Harry's leg, cutting away the frozen fabric with careful movements. He had some medical training, she could tell. Not a doctor, but someone who had learned to treat wounds in the field. She brought water. Put Hermann the rooster on to cook. She had been saving him for Christmas, and Christmas had arrived early. Fritz helped without being asked, his young face set with concentration. The cabin that had felt empty moments before now seemed impossibly crowded. 3 enemies taking up space, breathing her air, making everything suddenly, terrifyingly real. If the SS found them here, they would all be executed. But Harry's wound was seeping through Robin's attempts at bandaging, and the boy, because that's what Harry was, just a boy, looked like Hermann must have looked in those final hours at Stalingrad. She could not think about that. Would not. The second knock came at 10:22. The Americans heard it. Their bodies tensed. Robin's hand went to his empty belt. They looked at her with expressions that needed no translation. Don't answer it. But you cannot hide 3 men in a cabin the size of a closet. You cannot pretend emptiness when smoke rises from the chimney and lamplight leaks through cracks. She walked to the door. Behind her, the Americans shifted, preparing for whatever came next. Fritz had gone completely still. She opened the door. 4 German soldiers stood in the snow. Real Wehrmacht infantry, not the boys and old men the army had been conscripting lately, but hardened men with the look of veterans. One was clearly an officer, a corporal by his insignia. They wore feldgrau that blended with winter trees, rifles slung over shoulders, faces raw with cold. "Guten Abend," the corporal said. His name, she would learn, was Heinz Klostermann. Polite, almost formal. "We saw your light. We have been walking for 6 hours. May we share your fire?" She stood in the doorway. Behind her, absolute silence, the kind that screams. The corporal's eyes moved past her into the cabin. She saw the moment he registered what was there. The American uniforms, the blood. Robin's hand still pressed against Harry's thigh. His expression went carefully, professionally blank. "I see," he said quietly. Time folded in on itself. She stood between 2 groups of men trained to kill each other. She was 42 years old, a baker's wife. She knew recipes, not diplomacy. She had already lost 1 son to this insanity. She would not, could not, lose Fritz, too. She lifted her chin, found her voice somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where grief lives. "Tonight is Christmas Eve." The words came out stronger than she felt. "There will be no shooting in this cabin." Klostermann stared at her. "I have 1 rooster," she continued, the words coming faster now. "His name is Hermann, and he is cooking. He is enough for 7 people if we share properly. I have potatoes, not many, but some. You can come in and eat and be warm, or you can stay in the snow and freeze. But if you come in, your weapons stay outside. All weapons, from everyone." She turned to look at the Americans. Repeated it in French. "Les armes, dehors, tous." Back to the Germans in their own language. "The same for you. No guns. Tonight we are not soldiers. We are just people who are cold and hungry. Tomorrow you can kill each other if you must, but not here, not on Christmas Eve, not in front of my son." Her voice broke on that last word. Fritz, her remaining boy, the one who still breathed, still had a future if this madness ever ended. Klostermann studied her face. She held his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to remember her place. But she had already crossed the line. There was no safe retreat. "You remind me of my mother," he said finally. Then, to her shock, he unslung his rifle, leaned it against the cabin's exterior wall, gestured to his men to do the same. Inside, after a long, suspended moment, She heard the clatter of American weapons being placed on the floor. The Germans entered. 7 people in a space meant for 2. The cabin became absurdly crowded. Americans pressed against one wall, Germans against the other, watching each other with the wariness of predators forced to share a cage. Harry remained in the chair because there was nowhere else for him to go. Robin kept his hands on the wound, medical training overriding everything else. Elisabeth moved with purposeful calm. She checked Hermann, the rooster cooking nicely in the small oven, peeled potatoes. Fritz helped, his hands steady despite his fear. One of the Germans, a young man barely 18 with frightened eyes, noticed Robin's hands on Harry's leg. He spoke to Klosterman, who nodded. The young German crossed the cabin, knelt beside Harry, spoke in halting English. "I study medicine, in Heidelberg, before war. I help?" Robin looked at him, at his hands, at the medical student's insignia on his uniform, nodded slowly. Together, they cleaned Harry's wound with water Elisabeth heated, used strips torn from a German undershirt as fresh bandages, worked with the unselfconscious focus of professionals engaged in shared purpose. The other men watched in silence. The lamp cast their shadows large against walls, turning them into giants, into myths, into something other than what they were, frightened boys far from home. Elisabeth carved Hermann, 7 portions. She was good at this, years of dividing bread among customers, ensuring fairness, the mathematics of equity. She served meat on mismatched plates, added boiled potatoes, poured water into 10 cups. They ate. Not comfortably, not like friends, but they ate together. And gradually, so gradually she almost missed it, the silence changed. Stopped being the silence of enemies waiting for violence, and became the silence of exhausted men grateful for hot food. Jim Rossi spoke first, asked in French about the region. Was this part of Belgium or Germany? Klosterman answered, also in French, the neutral tongue that allowed conversation without feeling like betrayal. They were near the border. The lines had shifted so many times, no one was quite sure anymore. This opening gave permission. Robin mentioned he was from the Midwest, Indiana, hoped to be a teacher after the war. One of the Germans, the medical student, whose name was Joseph, said his father was a teacher too, in Freiburg. They compared notes on education, on books they had read, on the particular challenges of learning Latin. The youngest German, Peter, asked Fritz how old he was. 12, Fritz said quietly. Peter nodded. His brother was 12, back home in Bavaria. He missed him terribly. I had a brother too, Elisabeth said, the words surprising her. Hermann, my eldest. He died at Stalingrad. The cabin went quiet. The Germans looked at their plates. Jim Rossi, whose French was good enough to understand, reached across cultural boundaries. I am sorry for your loss, madam. War takes everyone's children, she said, looking at all of them. These boys with their uniforms and rifles and propaganda. That is what I learned. It does not matter which side, the mothers cry the same. Klosterman's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but something in his face shifted. Recognition, perhaps, of truth that transcended national loyalty. They talked about trivial things after that. Christmas traditions, what they missed from home. Jim described his mother's cookies. Joseph talked about his grandmother's Stollen. Robin mentioned ice fishing on frozen lakes. Peter spoke of skiing in the Alps before the war made everything impossible. Around midnight, Fritz fell asleep at the table. Elisabeth covered him with their only blanket. The men arranged themselves as best they could in the cramped space. Americans on one side, Germans on the other, but the division felt more practical than ideological now. Someone should stand watch, Robin said in English. Klosterman understood enough, shook his head. Tonight we all sleep, or none of us do. They slept, fitfully, awkwardly, but they slept. Elisabeth remained awake longer, watching their faces in the dying lamplight, wondering what their mothers would think, wondering if those mothers were still alive. Dawn came gray and cold. The stove had died, no more wood. The men woke stiffly, their breath misting in frigid air. They prepared to leave in silence. The peace was ending. Outside, the war continued. Artillery had resumed before dawn, men dying within earshot. Klosterman examined Harry's leg, asked Joseph in German if Harry could walk. Joseph examined the wound, said slowly that Harry could manage, but not far, not fast. Klosterman nodded, stepped outside, retrieved his rifle. His men followed, but they did not point weapons, did not threaten, simply armed themselves to walk back into the war. Before leaving, Klosterman pulled out a compass, handed it to Jim Rossi. "Your lines are approximately 7 kilometers south-southwest," he said in French. "Follow the ridgeline. Avoid the roads. American patrols should be near Rutgen." Jim stared at the compass, at this gift that meant survival. "Why?" he asked. Klosterman looked at Elisabeth, back at Jim. "Because a woman fed us her Christmas rooster, and I do not want to make her sacrifice meaningless." He saluted Elisabeth, not the Nazi salute, but an old military salute, respect between equals. Then he was gone, his men following into snow, their footprints marking a trail north, away from American lines. The Americans waited 10 minutes. Robin helped Harry to his feet. They had no gift except gratitude, which they expressed in broken French and gestures that said more than language could. "You saved our lives," Jim said. "I cooked a rooster named Hermann," she replied. "Go home to your mothers." They left. The cabin felt enormous in their absence. Just her and Fritz and the silence. 3 days later, American troops swept through, declared the area secure, moved on. She told them nothing about Christmas Eve. They would not have believed her. The war ground on for 5 more months. The Battle of the Bulge claimed 19,000 American lives, more German. The Ardennes became a graveyard. But 7 men survived that forest, returned to their families, carried with them the memory of one night when enemies became humans sharing a table. 50 years passed. Fritz became a baker like his father, eventually emigrating to Hawaii, where he opened his own shop. He never forgot that Christmas Eve, never stopped wondering what happened to those soldiers. In 1995, a television show called Unsolved Mysteries featured his story. He was searching for the men who had shared that impossible night. Wanted to know if they had survived, if they remembered. The episode aired. Within weeks, his phone rang. "Is this Fritz Vincken?" The voice spoke English with a Midwestern accent. "Yes?" "This is Jim Rossi. I was in your mother's cabin. Christmas Eve, 1944. I never forgot." They met the following year. Fritz flew to the United States. Jim was 72 now, retired, grandfather to 5 children who had never known war. They embraced like brothers, cried like the boys they had been. "Your mother," Jim said, his voice breaking. "She was the bravest person I ever met." "She was just a baker's wife," Fritz replied, "who cooked a rooster." "She was more than that," Jim insisted. "She showed us we were still human. In the middle of hell, she proved it was possible to choose mercy." Elisabeth had died years earlier, in 1996. She never knew about the reunion, never learned that Jim had named his daughter Elisabeth in her honor, never discovered that Klosterman had survived the war, become a schoolteacher in Germany, told his students every Christmas about the night an ordinary woman stopped a war. But perhaps she knew anyway. Perhaps in whatever place the dead reside, she understood what that night meant. Not just for 7 men who lived instead of dying, but for everyone who heard the story afterward. Everyone who learned that choosing mercy is always possible, even when everything suggests otherwise. The cabin is gone now, torn down decades ago, replaced by forest that shows no sign of what happened there. But the story remains. Elisabeth Vincken was not a soldier or a politician or anyone history typically remembers. She was a baker's wife who lost one son to war and refused to lose anything more to its madness. On Christmas Eve 1944, she cooked a rooster named Hermann and insisted that enemies could eat at the same table. It was not much. 1 night, 1 meal, 7 men. But it was enough. Enough to prove that humanity persists even in circumstances designed to destroy it. Enough to show that the most revolutionary act is sometimes simply refusing to accept that hate is inevitable. And for 7 men, 3 Americans, 4 Germans, it was enough to carry them through the rest of their lives. A reminder that once, in a forest in winter, a woman stood in a doorway and said, "Not here, not tonight." And the world, for just a moment, listened.